My name is Dacia Clay. I'm the audio librarian here at Classical 91.7. While I'm a real librarian, I have a deep, dark secret. I know very little about classical music. I grew up listening to rock, and I know something about jazz. But when it comes to classical, I really want to learn. So, every week on this show, a classical music expert will give me a piece of classical music they think I should know, and then we'll discuss it. Come learn with me in the classical classroom. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Classical Classroom. I'm Dacia Clay, and here today with me are two members of the Cantus Vocal Ensemble. Cantus is a men's vocal ensemble out of Minnesota, which, as their Tiny Desk concert description on YouTube says, is a weird vocal vortex, which is basically the choral center of the U.S. Aaron Humble and Paul Rudoi are both tenors from the group. Aaron is a singer, a teacher, and a conductor. He's performed all over the U.S. and the world. He's been on Performance Today and a Prairie Home Companion. And you have a Texas connection, too, because you live part-time in Dallas, don't you?
That's true, yes. My husband lives in Dallas, and so I spend the time commuting between the two cities whenever I can.
And your two cats who have adorable names, what was it?
Chopstick and Toothpick.
Nice. Yeah. And Paul Rudoi has performed and recorded as a soloist with many ensembles. He's worked with Bobby McFerrin, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. He's premiered work by Nico Muhly, and he's also a composer. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, thanks.
So what are you guys going to be teaching me about today?
Well, we'd love to talk to you about using chamber music and the chamber music model in vocal music, which is what we do in Cantus.
Okay. So what is it that distinguishes chamber music from other kinds of music, other kinds of, say, classical music to start with?
Well, the main distinction would be two. The first is that the ensemble is usually a smaller, more intimate ensemble. And the second thing is that there is no conductor or music director. And people are very used to seeing string quartets or a woodwind ensemble, a piano quintet, playing with just the musicians. But when it's vocal music, you always expect to see a conductor, unless we're talking about barbershop quartets or something very small.
Right.
So it's kind of a unique way to make music for a vocal ensemble, but it has been a really rewarding way to make music for us.
So isn't it true, it's kind of a nice sentiment that everybody kind of shares equal responsibility and nobody is a special snowflake. And, I'm sure that, artistically, that must be an interesting experience. But isn't it true that in, groups of humans, somebody always kind of winds up leading a group?
Yes. Well, okay. So that's a very good point. And one of the things that we do to kind of not combat that, but make it more efficient, is to have different processes in place to keep things rolling and keep things moving and make sure that people's voices are heard. Okay. So if you just take a rehearsal period, right, in a regular choir, the conductor would kind of lead that rehearsal period. While in Cantus and in other chamber ensembles, there is a sort of a facilitator per piece. So someone is leading the rehearsal process, but they're not necessarily making all the decisions that we have to go by, right? So if someone says, I think this breath would work really well here, or I think this voicing needs to change up, then the producer of that piece or the leader of that piece then facilitates that conversation so that ultimately we end up with something that we all agree on and we can move forward with. So it's more about facilitating than it is leading,
Okay. And that was Paul, by the way, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, that's Paul. Yeah. and so basically what that means is that there's someone in the room maybe that hasn't spoken, and the producer can turn to that person and say, well, you're an expert in this field, but you haven't said anything. So what do you think about this? And it helps make sure that everyone's voice is heard. And the other thing that's really good is that we all know each other really well.
Yeah.
Which happens in a smaller group. So you can tell when someone kind of wants to say something but hasn't yet. It's actually a lot of, personal dynamics that have to be vetted out as you're working on this.
So having personally worked at co-ops and in public radio and, the places where people's voices in an organization are individually important. I can understand how kind of on a political level, an organizational level, that might be beneficial. But how is this beneficial to the music? Like how do we hear the democracy in the music?
I would start by saying that...
And this is Aaron, by the way.
This is Aaron, yes. Okay. Here in Minnesota, we have no shortage of special snowflakes. We have a lot of snowflakes. And, I suppose the way we like to think about it is that in Cantus, we would have 9 special snowflakes.
Okay.
Not that nobody is, but that everybody is.
Gotcha.
And so in the process of organizing the company, we do have 3 singers who are elected by a vote every year to be part of an artistic council and sort of spearhead different leadership roles.
I see.
I've heard that at Apple, they have this term of a directly responsible person. So like sort of who is at the end of the line.
Gotcha.
So that's really where the benefit starts, is in the programming itself. You have 9 sets of trained and critical eyes looking at a program and putting it together and saying, I don't know that the narrative that we want to tell holds up here. Right. And we need to look at this, or maybe we need this. And then by the time the process is over, the program has gone through a lot of revisions. And by the time it has a first performance, it's so different from where it started, but it is so much stronger than where it started. And then the same thing could be said about individual pieces of music. We assign a producer to do that initial score study and language research and performance practice research that a conductor would do. And they bring that into the first rehearsal, and we put the piece together. And then once the piece sort of is standing on its own legs, then everybody is welcome to weigh in. And that's when things are changed and things go from one person's interpretation to another until really it's sort of the art of consensus building. And I know that at one point when we had hired a new staff member in our office, that person didn't really understand that in one piece of music there might be musical decisions that were put forth by 9 different singers. Like they just couldn't wrap their mind around that. Isn't this piece of music one person's vision? But it's really not. It's really the vision of everybody that's in the room. And sometimes people have more to say, depending on what genre it is. I don't have a lot of experience in popular music, so when we are in that realm, people don't turn to me and say, Aaron, what do you think? Because they know that that's not my thing.
Right. So is there a good example of like a piece that we could hear where you can really hear that shared vision coming across into a working whole?
Well, okay, so that's a good segue into the fact that we do a lot of new commissioning as well, because we're a men's ensemble, and the amount of repertoire for men's ensembles is much smaller to the regular, mixed choir with sopranos and altos and tenors and basses. So one of our things that we like to do is add to the repertoire. So on our newest album, A Harvest Home, we actually have a piece called Eventide right at the end of the album that exemplifies this, because all that Aaron was saying plays into a new piece of music because it's never been done before.
Well, I produced the piece when we premiered this work, and we had sung a piece by Byron Adams before. He's actually a musicologist out of Riverside, California, UC Riverside. He studied a lot of English music, the music of Vaughan Williams, and we sang this little piece of his that was so perfect. It was just this tiny little 2.5-minute piece that is so brilliantly constructed. And so when we commissioned him, it was for a concert about Dvorak. And it was sort of this serendipitous thing where we found out that Byron had studied with Karl Husa, who had studied with Dvorak's teacher. And it was like this lineage right from Dvorak. And it was just sort of magical.
Wow.
So we were already, pretty invested as a group in this project because we'd done all of this Dvorak, and then we're putting this concert together about Dvorak and all of the people that he sort of influenced. We liked Byron Adams' music, knew he was a musicologist, knew he'd write something that would be really well informed, and then we find out that like he's like the great grandson of Dvorak's musical lineage, and that so that was amazing.
Wow, that's very cool.
So one of the things that we always try to do by default, the producer sort of starts leading the piece, giving the first breath and getting everybody to come in, but as soon as possible, we want to give away opportunities for leadership when the producer's part is not important, when the producer's part does not have the melody or doesn't have like the moving notes that resolve. Thinking about that piece in particular, I had one of the baritones start the piece because it just worked better for him to set the tempo. And then I took over and sort of led the opening phrase. And then at the end of that, I'm seeing the score in my head, so I would say the end of the first page, the baritones have a suspension resolution, ba-da-da. And it would have made no sense for me to lead that because I'm not singing it. So like that, once I hand that control over to somebody else, then I have to, allow them to interpret with their own musical sensibilities.
So, can you guys explain to my totally untrained ears what shared vision is being expressed in this particular piece?
It's a little, I guess another way to put it is like the game of telephone.
Yeah.
Like you pass it along to someone else, and they have the opportunity to really choose where the next turn goes.
Yeah.
And then you pass along to somebody else. And then ultimately, you all have an equal say in what weird sentence you put together.
So you're kind of like working together as like a flock of birds almost. I don't know why this analogy came up, but like, birds sort of instinctively communicate to each other where we're going to fly now, and then they kind of just go that way together.
That's actually really, really good because especially for Cantus, with the amount of rehearsal, we rehearse 5 days a week, 5 hours a day.
Wow.
When we are rehearsing, because it's our full-time job. So we have the time to become a flock of birds.
Yeah, you develop that sensitivity.
Right. We'll instinctually figure out, there are some things that we need to figure out in rehearsal. Obviously, it's a lot of rehearsal because we don't have a director. But there are things like when exactly to put the T on at the end of a phrase. That kind of becomes instinctual with the 9 of us over time.
So I'm beginning to understand how, as an artist, as a singer, this kind of being a special snowflake among other special snowflakes can be sort of freeing. You're kind of trusting the control in the hands of other people and seeing where they take your creative vision and vice versa. But do you largely struggle with that, or do you enjoy it? Different people have different personalities. Some people enjoy following, but it sounds like you're a group of leaders leading each other.
Yeah, this is Paul. I think that it's both.
Yeah.
It's very freeing at times because you're able to, you agree with what something has been said, and you decide on something that maybe a director with one viewpoint wouldn't have decided on. And yet it's very musical. It really works. But then you also have to trust, and this is the really hard part. You have to trust when you don't believe in something and 8 or even 5 other people do.
Oh, wow.
And that is really, really hard because sometimes...
And you have to do it anyway.
Right.
Right.
Well, that's why it's basically consensus. So we have to agree that the majority believes that this is going to work.
Yeah.
And it's something as simple as a breath here. But then you could be like, but that doesn't really work with the way that the poem says itself to me, and then everybody else says, but I see it as different, and you can literally at the end of that conversation say, I'm just going to disagree and we'll continue. But the other great thing about it is we tour and we perform, 60 to 80 concerts a year. So after concert 7, Somebody can bring that up in a pre-concert rehearsal. So somebody can say, okay, I've tried it, 6 times now. And for some reason, it feels weird to me. Can we try it the other way just for one concert and see?
Yeah.
It
sounds like most of the time this kind of plays out to everyone's benefit. I mean, that comes across clearly in your music. But can you talk about some times when this sort of shared leadership approach has failed musically?
I don't know if I would say it's ever failed musically.
Okay.
Because with 9 good musical minds in the room, like somebody is always going to have the right idea. I really believe that, and I've been with Cantus for 10 years, and I've seen a lot of different singers come through the group. When I started, there's only one other person in the room now that was there on my first rehearsal, and there's something that is exactly the same. Even though the cast of characters is changing, there is something that is Cantus that is not Aaron and Paul and our 7 colleagues. It's sort of greater than the sum of its parts.
Right.
I think one of the biggest challenges is as a singer, whether it's an opera, oratorio, or even in a choir, there's basically one person who's allowed to criticize you, and that's the conductor. The conductor can say, you're dragging, you're fast, you're flat, you're sharp, I can't understand your diction, whatever. The conductor can say anything to you. But in Cantus, all of your colleagues can say that. So, it's really kind of alarming sometimes for people to come into a rehearsal and see me turn to another singer and say, you're flat on that C, you need to be higher because you're the 5th. Yeah. And that's just the truth. It's just me delivering the information. And I think all professional music would be better if musicians would put their egos aside and free themselves to have those discussions.
You must develop such a thick skin when you're kind of dealing with that. I mean, I think it's hard for anyone to accept artistic criticism because your art comes so from you, your essence, your heart, and to have people critique it in, I'm imagining, not always the most polite way.
Yes, I mean,
must get to you.
It can, but if it serves the music, then people are open to hearing it.
Yeah.
Everybody has to learn how to communicate in that environment. I grew up near Cleveland, and Paul has spent a lot of time in New England, so we speak more directly than a lot of people do here in the upper Midwest.
Right.
So we've both had to learn how to put our, kid-friendly and northern-friendly guards on, and perhaps deliver things with a bit more grace than you do in Cleveland. You just kind of throw it out there. But if it serves the music, I really think people will be receptive. And isn't that better than singing night after night with a colleague who is singing a wrong note or singing flat and not being able to turn to them and say, just so you know you're singing a wrong note here, you should fix it.
Yeah.
And that's not like, oh, look how smart I am, I'm better than you. It's let's do what the composer wanted, and then it will be even better.
And let's make the best music we can.
Yeah.
Well, so, and it's kind of like you are being honed as a performer and as a listener through this process. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that this is a distant relative to what is happening to a lot of major corporations around in the world. We've seen so many amazing studies about the fascinating changes that Google or Apple or whatever have made. I mean, I don't know if, I think it was, I remember reading something about, maybe it was Pixar, but Steve Jobs at one point put everything that anyone ever really needed outside of their cubicle in the center of the building. And that included bathrooms.
Yeah.
And everything. So people had to communicate with each other, and then ideas were exchanged. It's the same thing. If you're alone, then your ego will boost because you have to have a boosted ego in order to survive. But if you're with people and it's really not about you, It makes it about whatever it is that's outside of you, and that's the music that we work with.
Yeah, I heard an interview with one of the higher-ups at Google talking about how when the company first began, they had this board, and whenever they had a problem that they couldn't solve, they would put it up on this board, and it was a board that everyone passed every day. And so people who had come up...
It's like Good Will Hunting, the movie.
It is. How you like them apples. And so, like, yeah, people... But it would be everybody from the CEO to, the janitor, like Good Will Hunting. It would come across
Exactly.
it and would come up with solutions to these problems. And he was saying that is exactly how they got ahead, was by being open to everybody's creative vision.
It's true. And I mean, even speaking about companies, that's how we work as a company as well. I mean, it's important to have all of those different viewpoints. So. My journey, your journey, my journey, yours. My journey, your journey, my journey,
I was listening to your Tiny Desk concert, and the first song that you sang, I was kind of like, oh, this is a very nice piece. It sounded something that I would kind of expect for a group of vocalists to sing together. But the next song that you sang was an A.R. Rahman song, the guy who did the soundtrack for Slumdog Millionaire.
Yeah.
And it was so interesting. I was like, what is happening right now? Can you talk about your range? Like, why choose that? What is it that kind of makes a cantus piece?
That's a great question. This is Paul. And I think that going back to what Aaron said about programming, how if it doesn't fit the narrative, then we don't use it. In another way to think about it is, if it's good music, then we use it.
Yeah, okay.
So it doesn't really matter what genre.
Yeah.
It really matters about the narrative. So say we have a narrative that, just like, I don't know, a book or whatever. There's a narrative throughout the story that makes you want to continue, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe we have a narrative from birth to death, okay? And then toward the end of that narrative, we have 3 pieces about, moving on from this life. But we actually had that in a program 4 or 5 years ago, and it included a piece from Billings, from early American music, to an arrangement of a Dave Matthews tune, and then a brand new piece by Malcolm Dalglish, a composer and arranger in the United States. And those 3 pieces together really fed the narrative in a really cool way, and people got it. But they were 3 completely different pieces. They had nothing to do with each other independently of one another. But together, they made up that important aspect of that narrative, and the same thing goes. So that's why we have a bunch of different styles and genres, is because we program that way.
Yeah.
And we want to be open to all styles of music and really allow the audience to hear some music that is easy for them to hear and receive, but also introduce them to some new things that they may fall in love with, and also challenge them a little bit. We play everywhere from Houston Friends of Music, which is a very astute crowd, Lincoln Center, which is a very astute crowd. But we also were in Parkersburg, West Virginia this year, in this little college sort of gymnasium auditorium, with a largely, working class community, and the same program can speak to all of those different audiences. And classical music has been this thing that's elite and exclusive. And, for all of the people that spent time trying to make it that way, I would love to, back over them with my car, because they have done a great disservice to classical music, because, Mozart was popular music in his day. And maybe Mozart's never going to be playing on, Hot FM 101 anymore, but we shouldn't take classical music away from anybody.
Absolutely. I love the idea that music, it's more important that music shares passion, heart, sort of an essence when you're putting, your programs together. And when you're putting together, I don't know, your playlist on your iPod or whatever. But it is modern technology that kind of, I think, has allowed us as listeners and you guys as a performing group to be able to have access to all kinds of different music and to kind of make choices about what you put into your shows based on what I would say were very kind of intellectual and subtle and nuanced choices, instead of going, okay, well, this stuff is in this key and this is in this key. You're like, no, this Lady Gaga piece and this Mozart piece go together because, whatever you decide.
That will be on our next program.
Please do that.
We hope.
But yeah, how has technology influenced your work? Has it? I don't know. This is a totally random question. It just came up.
Oh, it absolutely has. I mean, every year we do a cover show where we do the same programming that we usually do. So we bring in different pop and rock tunes, either recently or, from way back when, that we want to cover in some fashion. Either we want to, and then we have a band, behind us and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that technology needed for that sort of music we use, and it influences us and the way that we think about the music that we do. Mm-hmm. We will sing Mozart in our more classical touring program, but that'll somehow be influenced by, the Beck song that we arranged last year. So that's the other thing, is it just builds on itself the more that we practice and the more that we work on the different types of music. But we also are able to, look up on our phones the historical background of this piece, or we'll figure out, a better metronome app than the one that we currently using. I mean, technology is hugely influential in every music, including classical.
Yeah.
And just from a research perspective, the resources that are available now online are just incredible. We're putting together now a program of Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian music, looking at how music played a role in the fall of communism in the Baltic states, because it was the way that people kept their heritage alive. And the last time we did a program with some of this music, we were a little light on the Lithuanian repertoire. And so I was able to find somebody who runs a Lithuanian music archive and got in touch with someone who was super enthusiastic. And if they didn't have it in a men's version, he would just make one and send it to me. So we've added like 3 pieces of Lithuanian repertoire to this program, because I found this person on the internet.
That's so cool.
20 years ago, that wouldn't have been possible. I would have had to get on a plane, fly to Lithuania, and dig through archives.
Right.
So, to have that repertoire available to us now, just, through a few clicks of a mouse or touchpad these days is amazing.
Yeah. No, it's
really cool.
Crazy when it comes to music. I mean, just how it's opened the world up, that I can go to my computer and go to your SoundCloud page and check your stuff out. When I was a kid, I couldn't do that. I mean, that's
true.
It's
very true.
And we get email and Facebook messages from people literally all over the world. Just the other day, to my personal page, I got a message from some guy in Hungary who was telling me that he really liked my voice.
Nice.
And that's cool. That's amazing.
That's so awesome.
Super cool. Well, Aaron Humble and Paul Rudoi of Cantus, I said it wrong at the beginning, Cantus.
Nice.
Thank you so much for being on the Classical Classroom today. It was really awesome to talk to you guys.
Yeah, thanks so much.
It was our pleasure. I hope a lot of people will come out and hear us for the concert in Houston.
Chamber Music Houston is actually bringing Cantus to Houston February 10th. They're going to be at Rice Studi Hall. I'll definitely be there. I hope to see some of you listeners there too. All right, everybody, that about does it for this here episode of Classical Classroom. Thanks today to audio producer Todd, Sir Toddsalot, Hulslander, for making us sound good. Thanks to program director St. John Flynn for his frequent and oh-so-helpful critiques of my fashion choices. Thanks to Mark DeClaudio for his assistance and piercing blue eyes. Thanks to Cantus and Aaron Humble and Paul Rudoi for their generous time on the show today. Thanks to me for saying words, but mostly, thanks to you for listening. We'll catch you next time.